The afternoon sun was sinking behind the tree line when I heard frantic footsteps pounding toward my gate, followed by the shrill cry of a woman who believed the world bent to her rules. I didn't know then that locking one simple gate would expose years of hidden entitlement. Subscribe. Stay with me, because what unfolded next proved that truth doesn't shout, it reveals. The day had started quietly, with the soft hum of lawnmowers and distant laughter drifting through the neighborhood. My home sat at the edge of the cul-de-sac, bordered by a wooden fence and a metal side gate that led into my backyard. It was a private space, a space I had rebuilt after months of saving, repairing, and planning. The gravel walkway was freshly laid, the garden beds newly shaped, and everything felt finally under my control. But peace has a way of attracting disruption, and in this neighborhood, that disruption always had one source. Karen, the self-appointed voice of the HOA. Karen's house sat directly across from mine, a place where blinds never fully closed and her eyes never stopped watching. For months she had circled the neighborhood like a storm cloud, filing complaints, offering corrections, and inserting herself into decisions that weren't hers to make. Her presence could be felt long before it was seen. And recently, she had developed a new obsession: the gate along my fence line. She insisted it connected to shared property, even though the HOA map clearly marked the boundary as private. But reason never held much weight with someone convinced she was the keeper of order. That afternoon, I had been securing a lock on the side gate, a simple precaution after recent trespassing concerns. The metal clicked reassuringly beneath my hand. I didn't imagine the act would carry any significance. It was my gate on my land. Yet from across the street, I noticed Karen standing frozen on her porch, gripping a clipboard as if it were a badge. Her eyes narrowed, her posture stiffened, and I could almost sense the accusation forming in her mind. I wiped my hands, stepped back, and for a moment thought the day would end quietly. But Karen had already begun marching toward me. She wasn't alone. A group of unfamiliar guests, people dressed casually, holding drinks and chattering, followed behind her, filing down the sidewalk toward my property line. They looked confused, as if they weren't sure why they were being led there, but Karen waved them forward with theatrical urgency. The entire scene felt surreal, like watching actors who didn't realize they were in the wrong scene. I noticed the impatience in her pace, the way she kept glancing at the gate as if expecting it to magically swing open. Something inside me sank. She's about to make this a spectacle, I thought. The guests stopped in front of the gate, adjusting their sunglasses, murmuring among themselves. I recognized none of them. Karen pointed toward the lock as if presenting evidence of a crime. She gestured broadly, explaining some rules she had likely reinvented moments earlier. I remained still, letting her performance unfold without interruption. The air felt heavy, thick with brewing conflict. The sky overhead dimmed slightly as clouds passed, casting shifting shadows across the fence. It reminded me how quickly peace can be swallowed by someone determined to disrupt it. And Karen had not come seeking conversation. She had come seeking conflict. When she reached the gate, she grabbed the metal frame and shook it sharply, testing its strength as though confirming her worst fear, that she could not control it. Her guests watched awkwardly, unsure whether to step closer or pretend nothing unusual was happening. I stood a few feet away, silent, observing. It was clear she expected me to rush forward, apologize, or remove the lock. But I simply stood firm, the gravel crunching under my shoes as I shifted my weight. In her eyes, silence was defiance, and defiance was unforgivable. Her chest tightened, her face flushed. This wasn't about rules, it was about control slipping from her hands. Karen suddenly turned toward her guests and began explaining that this path, my gated side yard, was part of a shared community walkway. The claim was absurd. There was no walkway, just my property. But she spoke with the confidence of someone who believed repetition turned fantasy into fact. Her guests nodded slowly, the confusion on their faces replaced by polite acceptance. They were visitors, unaware of her long history of bending rules to suit her emotions. As she talked, I felt a quiet realization settle in. Today wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a confrontation she had been waiting for. The moment came when she tried pushing the gate again, harder this time, her hand slipping slightly on the metal. Her frustration rippled outward, tightening her shoulders and sharpening her movements. She turned toward me, her voice cracking under a sudden burst of emotion. Though she hadn't yet screamed, the storm was building behind her words. Her guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the escalation. The air around us felt like a held breath, ready to snap. Somewhere deep within, I felt the calm that comes before impact. I watched her inhale sharply, her chest rising like a wave preparing to crash. Her face flushed, her fists clenched, and for a moment the entire world seemed to narrow into this single confrontation. She lifted her chin, eyes wide with disbelief and indignation, staring at the lock as if it were a personal affront. And then the scream came, sharp, echoing, carrying through the street like an alarm tearing through the quiet. She yelled about shared property, about rules being broken, about authority being ignored. Her voice cracked into desperation. And as the sound traveled across the houses, I realized the truth. Karen wasn't fighting for community rules. She was fighting for relevance. Her guests froze, startled by the intensity erupting from someone they barely knew. The neighborhood paused with them. A curtain shifted. A dog barked once, then went silent. The moment felt suspended, stretched thin across the fence line. I stood still, letting her scream dissolve into the air. This is the moment everything changes, I thought. Not because of the lock or the gate, but because entitlement had finally met a boundary it couldn't push through. And as Karen stood trembling with anger, I understood that this was only the beginning. The real conflict, the one hidden beneath her outrage, was still waiting to unfold. The day after Karen's outburst, the neighborhood felt unsettled, as if the echo of her scream still lingered between the houses. People passed slowly on their morning walks, glancing toward my gate with a cautious curiosity of those sensing tension but afraid to acknowledge it openly. The air was cooler, the light softer, yet beneath the calm was an unmistakable awareness that a line had been crossed. I walked the perimeter of my yard, checking the fence, noticing how the lock still hung steady and unbroken. It wasn't the metal that mattered, it was the boundary it represented. And Karen hated boundaries that weren't hers to control. Later that evening, an envelope appeared in my mailbox, thick, crisp, and stamped with the HOA seal. I already knew what it was before opening it. Inside lay a formal complaint accusing me of impeding community access, restricting neighborhood functions, and violating shared property agreements. None of these claims existed in the bylaws. Not one. It was a document created not from policy, but from anger. Karen's signature sat boldly at the bottom, the ink pressed deeper than necessary, as though she wanted her authority to be felt through the paper. I exhaled slowly. The gate had become more than a gate, it had become a battlefield. That night, I stood near the kitchen window watching Karen host another gathering. Her guests clustered around her fire pit, talking quietly while she paced the patio, gesturing animatedly toward my house. Her hands moved sharply, slicing through the air as if she was narrating a crime scene rather than a disagreement. Her guests nodded politely, their expressions sympathetic even though they had no idea what actually happened. It struck me then how entitlement thrives in the shelter of an audience. Karen didn't need truth. She needed validation. And as long as someone listened, she would find a way to feel powerful again. The next morning, an HOA board member named Lucas approached my driveway. He was quiet, reserved, and far more reasonable than most people involved in community governance. He explained that Karen had demanded an emergency review, not a meeting, not a conversation, but a review of my actions. His tone carried a mixture of embarrassment and exhaustion, as though he had grown tired of being pulled into conflicts he didn't believe in. He admitted, almost apologetically, that HOA protocol required them to inspect the property after a formal complaint. I nodded. It wasn't his fault. But once again, Karen was forcing others to participate in her crusade. As Lucas walked the perimeter with a clipboard, I noticed him pause several times, perplexed by the simplicity of the situation. There was no shared path, no common walkway, no reason for Karen's claims. He took pictures, measurements, and notes, each step further confirming what we both knew: there was nothing to investigate. Yet procedure demanded he continue. When he finished, he offered a small, knowing sigh. "This won't hold up," he said quietly. His expression carried something deeper than frustration, sympathy for both the community and the conflict it had been dragged into. But procedure alone couldn't stop Karen. She operated on emotion, not logic. Later that afternoon, I saw Karen standing near the gate again, this time alone. Her posture was rigid, her arms crossed, her jaw clenched. She stared at the lock as if trying to force it open with sheer indignation. There was something haunting in that stillness, A person whose identity depended on control now facing the reality of limitation. She paced back and forth, muttering under her breath, shaking her head as though convincing herself she was still in the right. Watching her, I realized the gate wasn't the issue. It was the symbol of a world she couldn't manipulate. The following day, the HOA sent a notice scheduling a hearing, not against me, but to evaluate the validity of Karen's complaint and the necessity of property access. For the first time, the language was neutral, not accusatory. It suggested doubt in her claims, a subtle shift in authority. The meeting was set for the weekend. Word spread quickly. Neighbors exchanged glances, whispered in driveways, quietly amused or quietly relieved. Some had endured Karen's interference for years, silently tolerating it to avoid conflict. Now, her power was being questioned openly. And nothing threatens an authoritarian mind more than on the morning of the hearing. I found Karen outside again, pacing her porch like a general preparing for battle. She held a fresh stack of papers, maps printed from outdated sources, misinterpreted boundary lines, highlighted code sections pulled out of context. She looked frantic, rehearsing arguments, scanning the street as though preparing witnesses that didn't exist. Her certainty had cracked. Desperation seeped through the fractures. I felt a strange mixture of frustration and pity. Entitlement, when challenged, doesn't retreat gracefully. It flails. It grabs. It spirals. And Karen was spiraling in real time. Inside the hearing room, the board sat distracted, flipping through files that contradicted Karen's claims. The atmosphere was stiff, uncomfortable, like a teacher forced to address the misbehavior of a student who refused to see their error. When the meeting began, Karen launched into explanations before anyone asked a question. Her voice wavered between confidence and panic, insisting the gate had always functioned as shared property access. Lucas gently corrected her. There were no records, no maps, no precedent. The truth sat plainly on the table, yet she pushed harder, her reasoning unraveling with each breath. As the board listened, something shifted in the room, not loudly, but unmistakably. They weren't looking at me anymore. They weren't looking at the gate. They were looking at Karen, really looking, perhaps for the first time without the filter of intimidation or habit. Her insistence, her exaggerations, her inability to accept boundaries. It all lay bare. And in that moment, I realized the outcome wasn't about the gate at all. It was about the pattern. The entitlement. The unchecked authority. The board adjourned the hearing with a promise to issue their decision soon. And as we all stepped outside, I knew the story was far from over. The real turning point was still coming. 2 days passed after the hearing, yet the tension in the neighborhood refused to settle. The sky hung low with thick gray clouds, and the cool breeze carried a sharp edge that hinted at change. I walked past the gate that morning, feeling the weight of everything it represented: privacy, boundaries, and the right to peace. But the lock wasn't what stayed on my mind. It was Karen's face during the hearing, the wild desperation beneath her attempted composure, the frantic search for control slipping away. That expression said more than her words ever could. Something deeper was unraveling behind her crusade. I spent the morning clearing leaves from the yard, letting the quiet rhythm of work ground me. But across the street, Karen's blinds flickered open and shut, like a lighthouse sending signals into stormy waters. Occasionally, I saw her silhouette pacing. At other times, she stood completely still, staring at my property as if willing the gate to yield. Her behavior wasn't the fury of someone enforcing rules. It was the fear of someone losing influence. The more I watched, the more it became clear that her anger wasn't truly directed at me. The gate had simply become a target for something much older and far more personal. That afternoon, I received an unexpected message from an older neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, asking if she could speak with me privately. She approached my driveway with a hesitant smile and eyes that carried years of unspoken stories. She had lived here longer than anyone else and had witnessed every shift in the community's tone. When she spoke, her voice held a gentle sadness. She explained how Karen's need for control had begun long before I moved in, how she had repeatedly overstepped, overruled, and overshadowed others until the entire neighborhood learned to walk around her presence instead of confronting it. Mrs. Hargrove described a pattern that fit perfectly with what I'd seen. Karen inserting herself into decisions that weren't hers, demanding compliance, twisting rules to maintain dominance. People had tried challenging her before, but she had always found a way to intimidate through paperwork, threats, or sheer persistence. Most neighbors, especially the elderly, had grown tired of the battle and simply allowed her reign to continue. Listening to her, I felt something heavy settle in my chest, a mix of empathy for those who endured this for years and frustration that one person had shaped an entire community through force of personality. Later that evening, Ayla arrived home and sensed the shift in my expression. As we sat in the living room, warm lamplight casting soft shadows across the walls, I explained everything Mrs. Hargrove had shared. Ayla listened intently, her hands resting folded in her lap, her posture straight but relaxed. When I finished, a thoughtful silence filled the room. "So it wasn't just us," she murmured. The thought lingered in the air. Our conflict was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of unchecked behavior. And without realizing it, we had stepped into the center of a much larger story. Ayla leaned forward, her gaze steady with quiet determination. She wasn't driven by anger. She never had been. Instead, she felt the weight of responsibility. She knew how systems worked, how fairness depended on structure, and how misuse of authority could corrode trust. She suggested reviewing the HOA policies again, not to prepare for defense, but to understand the full framework of the board's responsibilities. As she studied, her calm became a kind of assurance. This wasn't a fight she sought, but one she refused to abandon. Not for herself. Not for the neighbors who had been silent for too long. As Ayla read through the documents, I walked outside to clear my mind. The neighborhood felt unusually still, the air heavy with anticipation. The sound of Karen's front door opening broke the quiet. She stepped onto her porch, clutching a worn binder, the same binder she used to cite rules during HOA meetings. Her hands shook slightly. She scanned the street with restless eyes, the weight of the upcoming board decision pressing against her composure. She looked less like a figure of authority and more like a person confronting the collapse of something she built her identity around. From my driveway, I watched her approach a couple walking their dog. Her gestures were animated, frantic, her voice carrying the brittle edge of someone trying to recruit support before an inevitable downfall. But the couple listened politely and then walked away without engaging. Karen's shoulders fell slightly. She tried again with another neighbor. The same result. Her authority no longer intimidated. Without fear backing it, her influence was hollow. And I realized something powerful. Communities don't change when rules change. They change when people stop accepting the unreasonable. And the neighborhood had finally grown tired. That night, as rain began to fall softly against the roof, Ayla and I sat together reviewing the final pieces of the HOA regulations. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil unfolding across the street. Ayla made notes, highlighted sections, and marked procedural inconsistencies Karen had violated repeatedly. Her preparation was meticulous, not driven by vengeance but by the belief that systems should work for everyone, not just the loudest voice. Watching her, pride settled deep within me. She wasn't just navigating conflict. She was guiding us as the rain tapered to a soft drizzle. A calmness settled inside our home, the kind of calm that comes before decisive change. Tomorrow, the HOA board would reconvene to deliver their findings. The outcome would shape the future of the neighborhood, and perhaps even Karen's place within it. I stood by the window, watching water bead across the gate's metal surface. This is bigger than a boundary, I thought. The gate had simply revealed truth, not about property, but about people. And as I turned toward Ayla, who closed her binder with quiet confidence, I knew the turning point was coming. The morning of the board's second review arrived with a quiet heaviness that hung low over the neighborhood. The sky was a pale silver, diffused with soft light that made every house look like it was holding its breath. Ayla and I stepped outside, walking together in calm silence. The streets were unusually empty, but blinds twitched and silhouettes lingered near windows, watching without wanting to be seen. For months, perhaps years, people had tolerated Karen's grip on the community. But something had changed after her meltdown at the gate. The neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. It was simply waiting for the truth to land. At the community center, the room felt different from before. The chairs were rearranged, the atmosphere grounded rather than strained. Board members sat with folders open, their posture focused, no longer intimidated by the presence of the loudest voice in the room. Karen entered moments later, binder clutched tightly in her arms, eyes darting around for familiar support. But the usual nods and affirming smiles weren't there. She paused, disoriented, sensing the shift. She took her seat stiffly, her expression strained. This time she wasn't facing the board as its most assertive member. She was facing them as someone under scrutiny. When the meeting began, the board addressed the issue not as a complaint against me, but as a matter of pattern evaluation and authority misuse. The phrasing alone sent a visible jolt through Karen's composure. She attempted to collect herself, flipping frantically through her notes. The board began by reviewing the property maps, boundary records, and previous notices she had filed. They spoke slowly, carefully, letting the documentation reveal what they already knew. There was no shared walkway, no rule granting her access, no justification for the accusation she had made. The facts lay bare on the table, undeniable and unmoved by emotion. Karen attempted to interject several times, insisting her actions were rooted in community safety and historical precedent. But the board members, now grounded in clarity instead of intimidation, gently pushed back. They noted inconsistencies in her reports, irregular wording, and violations of communication protocol. They showed her the documented timeline, pointing out moments when she bypassed procedure entirely. Their tone was firm, not confrontational, the same tone used when revealing truths that can no longer be ignored. Karen's hands trembled as she clung to the binder in her lap, the very binder she had used as a weapon for years. As the questioning deepened, neighbors began entering quietly, filling the back rows of the room. Their presence wasn't loud or disruptive, it was supportive. Some crossed their arms, some leaned forward, some sat completely still, but all watched intently. When the board invited residents to speak, they stepped forward one by one. Small stories emerged: unfair fines, aggressive warnings, property inspections conducted without notice, and moments when simple neighborly disagreements became full HOA investigations. None of them had escalated publicly before. But now, with one act of defiance illuminating years of overreach, they found their voices. And Karen watched her influence crumble. Throughout the testimonies, Ayla sat calmly among the advisors, her expression composed, her posture steady. She wasn't here to punish Karen. She was here to help restore balance, something the community had forgotten it deserved. When asked to share her professional insight, Ayla spoke with quiet authority, outlining the importance of procedural fairness, transparency, and the danger of allowing one individual to interpret rules for personal preference. Her words weren't sharp. They weren't harsh. They were factual, and facts, delivered without bias, created a clarity that opinion could not defeat. Even the board seemed steadier under her guidance. Karen's composure finally cracked when the board presented documented evidence of her overriding previous decisions without authorization. She leaned forward, her face flushed, insisting she had been trying to uphold standards. But the emotion behind her words wasn't dedication, it was fear. The board calmly challenged her explanations, each question revealing more contradictions. Her control, once reinforced by certainty, now faltered beneath the weight of accountability. She looked around the room for support, searching for someone, anyone, to validate her. But the neighbors who once feared her now sat silently, united not by anger, but by relief. When the board asked if she had anything further to contribute, Karen sat back slowly, her expression defeated. Her hands loosened around the binder, fingers slipping off its edges as though the weight of it had finally become too much. Silence spread through the room, thick but not cruel, the kind of silence that comes when truth has finally been spoken and there is nothing left to argue. Karen looked down at the table, her breathing unsteady. For the first time, she wasn't fighting. She was absorbing. And the reality she faced wasn't punishment. It was reflection, a mirror she had avoided for too long. The board stepped aside to deliberate, leaving the room buzzing with a quiet hum of anticipation. Neighbors whispered softly, not with hostility, but with a sense of long-awaited closure. Ayla leaned toward me, her calm presence grounding the moment. She had been steady through the entire ordeal, never raising her voice, never losing her composure. Watching her now, I felt something shift inside me, a deep appreciation for the strength she carried so effortlessly. The final decision would shape the future of the neighborhood, but whatever happened next, the community had already changed in a way that couldn't be undone. When the board returned, the room fell silent before they even spoke. Their expressions were resolute, their decision already forming the shape of tomorrow. I could feel the message before hearing it. The neighborhood was standing on the edge of accountability. And Karen, who had spent years believing she was the standard everyone must follow, was about to face the reality of her actions. As the board prepared to speak, Ayla gently exhaled beside me, steady and unwavering. The final chapter of this conflict was arriving, and the truth, long suppressed and long avoided, was finally ready to be named. The board re-entered the room with a steady calm that signaled the end of uncertainty. Their footsteps echoed softly across the tiles as they took their seats, papers aligned neatly before them. A hush settled over the room, the kind that appears only when people sense a shift coming, a change that will alter the flow of a community. Ayla sat still beside me, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her expression composed and unwavering. Karen stared straight ahead, her body rigid, as though bracing herself against a storm she could no longer stop. Everything that had been building for months was about to land. The board began by acknowledging the concerns raised by residents, the inconsistencies found in documents, and the misuse of authority that had gone unchecked for far too long. Their words weren't harsh, they were factual, measured, and deliberate. Karen's eyes flickered downward as each point was spoken, her shoulders slowly sinking with the weight of their clarity. She tried to maintain composure, but her facade cracked with each moment of silence between the board's sentences. These weren't accusations anymore. They were conclusions, and the truth they carried left little room for argument. Then came the final piece, the decision. The board announced that Karen would be removed from her position on the HOA effective immediately. Her authority to issue notices, warnings, or fines was revoked. Furthermore, an oversight committee, including residents and external advisors, would be established to ensure proper checks moving forward. Ayla was asked to guide the committee temporarily, given her expertise. The words fell heavy in the air, not cruelly, but definitively. Karen's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the binder she still held. The power she once wielded so confidently had dissolved in front of an entire community. There was no applause, no celebration, only a profound, quiet release, like the exhale of a neighborhood finally relieved of a long-held tension. Karen rose abruptly from her chair, but the urgency in her movement wasn't anger. It was uncertainty. Years of commanding presence had been stripped away, leaving her fragile, exposed, and unsure of where to stand. She walked quickly toward the exit, avoiding every eye in the room. And for a moment, despite everything she had put us through, I felt a strange and unexpected sympathy. Losing control doesn't just change your environment. It changes who you believe you are. As the room dispersed, neighbors approached Ayla quietly, offering soft thank yous and gentle nods of gratitude. Some had been silent victims of Karen's authority. Others had simply suffered through the tension her presence created. For the first time, they felt seen, not by the HOA, but by someone who understood fairness beyond rules. Ayla accepted their appreciation with humility, never claiming victory, never boasting. Truth didn't need celebration. It only needed to be recognized. And she had helped reveal it with a calmness most people could never maintain under such pressure. Outside, sunlight broke through the shifting clouds, painting the pavement in warm tones. We walked home slowly, the quiet of the street no longer unsettling but peaceful. The air felt different, lighter, cleaner, unburdened. People stood on porches, waved gently, or offered small nods. The community seemed to breathe again, as if something oppressive had been lifted from the center of its chest. For the first time since we'd moved in, I felt the neighborhood as it was meant to be, a place of shared space, not shared fear, a place shaped by cooperation, not commanded by one person's will. When we reached our gate, the metal glinted softly in the afternoon sun. It wasn't just a gate anymore. It was a symbol of everything we had endured. I rested my hand on the lock, feeling its steady weight. This was never about property, I thought. It was about boundaries, emotional, personal, communal. The conflict had started with a scream and a claim of shared ownership, but it had ended with something far deeper, the reclaiming of a community's right to fairness. Ayla stepped beside me, her presence warm and grounding. She had carried us through chaos with quiet, unshakable strength. That evening, as we sat on our porch, a soft breeze moved through the trees, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and the distant hum of evening life. The neighborhood felt alive again, the tension finally dissolved. Karen's house remained dark and quiet. Her blinds were closed, her porch empty, a stark contrast to the commanding presence she once held. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel revenge. I felt closure. What happened wasn't about punishing her. It was about restoring balance to a place that had forgotten what fairness looked like. The gate had stopped being a battleground. It had become a reminder. As twilight settled over the street, Ayla leaned back against the porch railing, her eyes reflecting a soft glow from the setting sun. She wasn't thinking about the conflict anymore. She wasn't holding on to frustration or tension. She was simply present, steady, calm, and strong. I realized then that the true shift wasn't just in the HOA or the neighborhood. It was in us. We had learned to stand firm without anger, to speak without raising our voices, and to protect our space without hostility. The boundary we defended wasn't merely wood and metal. It was dignity. When the first stars appeared, I looked at the gate one last time. The metal shimmered faintly under the porch lights, a quiet symbol of everything we had endured and everything we had reclaimed. Ayla sighed gently, not with weariness, but with peace, the kind that follows storms that have finally passed. Truth doesn't need to shout, I thought. It just needs time. And as the night settled softly around us, I understood with absolute clarity. The gate hadn't divided us from anyone. It had brought an entire community back to itself.